Africa who will be joining us online to take the platform. Thank you.
Dr. Hubert? Dr. Hubert?
Colleagues, Your Excellencies, delegates, and our global audience, apologies for the technical hitch-up. We'll be connecting with Professor Hazen in a few minutes as the technology allows us. In the meantime, it is my singular honor to invite Ambassador Salah Ahmad, the head of AU African Governance Architecture and senior human rights expert. Ambassador, welcome.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol duly observed. Allow me to stand on the protocol that is in existence because of my 5 minutes time. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I bring you greetings from the African Union Commission, from His Excellency the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, and the Commissioner for Political Affairs and Peace and Security, and the entire members of the African Union Commission family. The African Union joins the international community to celebrate the World Press Freedom Day 2021 under the theme, Information as a Public Good, taking place here in this beautiful city of Windhoek, Namibia, which is where the historic Declaration of 1991 was drafted deliberated, and adopted. The declaration that is on the development of a free, independent, and pluralistic press to serve the public good with the information they need. This commemoration, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, is taking place in a difficult context as we are all faced and challenged by the COVID-19 pandemic. It is also a difficult time for journalism, freedom of expression, and freedom of the press, as they are all threatened around the world by different challenges and different obstacles. Attacks against media and journalists are attacks against democracy, attacks against freedom of all of us. We pay tribute to all journalists in Africa and in the world who have lost their lives in the exercise of the profession. We call on all states to condemn violence against journalists, to take actions to improve the safety and the protection of all journalists, with particular attention to women journalists, and to bring all those who have committed crimes against journalists to justice. The commemoration of this day is a reminder to all of us, members of the international community as well as African member states, to reiterate the respect for the commitment to press freedom and to pledge more efforts that to be done to protect the safety of journalists. This year's World Press Freedom Day is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to reaffirm the commitment of the African Union and its member states to enact more treaties and more standards and more norms that will guide our member states in their efforts to allow for the freedom of journalism and also the freedom of information and its access to it for all citizens. The theme of this year, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, recognizes the impact of changing communication systems on our health, our human rights, democracies, and also the development of the continent that we want. We also, in the African Union, wish to seize this moment to pay tribute to the UNESCO for its role in advocating for the safety and the protection of journalists in the entire world. The African Union reiterates its commitment to promote and protect freedom of expression and the right of access to information in the digital age. This commitment is underlined by the AU theme of 2021, Arts, Culture, and Heritage, Levers for Building the Africa We Want. It is also within this context, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the African Union Commission is committed to work closely with its member states, African civil society organizations such as the Federation of African Journalists, and also in collaboration with UNESCO to promote and to ensure that the safety of journalists is ensured and it's protected in each and every corner of the African continent. Let us, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, collectively work together to promote information as a public good. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Ambassador for the opening remarks and setting the tone for our engagements. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, please allow me to move a notch back and welcome Professor Hubert Hazen for the welcome remarks. I think we now have him online. Thank you. Please, Professor, proceed. We can hear you loud and clear. Proceed, Professor, we can hear you. We can hear you. Apologies once again. The professor is still facing some connectivity challenges. Please allow me to welcome Guy Booga, who will speak and officially welcome delegates on behalf of UNESCO. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moyle. Greetings, Ambassador. Greetings, all the participants and all the excellencies and stakeholders. I'm Guy Booga, and I work for UNESCO, Director for Strategies and Policies in the field of information and communication. It's a pleasure to welcome you here, and I apologize for the sound quality from our representative from the region. Maybe we can bring him back later if we sort that out. But let me say a few remarks just to tell us where we are. This is the Africa Forum, and in parallel we have the Asia Forum taking place immediately now. We have the European Forum taking place now, and then there are also forums in other parts of the world at different times. So Africa, you're watching and you're part of a global process. Of course, Africa participants should take pride that the World Press Freedom Day was born here in Africa. After a long period of difficult labor, this baby was born. And this baby was then available to share with the whole world. The whole world got this gift from Africa of the World Press Freedom Day. So here in Namibia, this is what happened 30 years ago. Now, of course, press freedom and freedom of expression, they are human rights. But they are not just an end in themselves, they are also a means to an end. And they are a means to humanity having quality information, which is essential for democracy and for development. Now, if we look at the history 30 years ago here in Namibia, in this very venue that we're in, African journalists got together and they called for free, pluralistic, and independent print press. And that was so influential that after that, besides for having World Press Freedom Day, many governments around the world decided to reform their monopolies on media, and they allowed for the development of a pluralistic press, which gave people a choice of information and which also served to make for some accountability, because governments then had to answer to a press. That was the value that came out of 30 years ago. And then 20 years ago, on the anniversary, there was another declaration which really promoted broadcasting. Broadcasting, up till that point in many parts of the world, was completely a state monopoly. And the result of this declaration, 10 years after the original Windhoek Declaration, the result was that broadcasting opened up and many more people could get voice on the airwaves. And there was also a transition in many countries from state broadcasting to public broadcasting, as well as then the benefit of having commercial broadcasting and community broadcasting. 10 years later, 2011, the focus of the declaration was on access to information. And that gave rise to a new day on the international calendar called the International Day for Universal Access to Information, which is on the 28th of September, a twin day to this day. Access to information, of course, is about getting governments to be transparent, both in terms of proactively disclosing the information they have and responding to requests from the stakeholders. And we've seen huge momentum, including in Africa, about governments getting into this particular momentum, which is so important, not least under COVID, with COVID data, contracts under COVID, policy development under COVID, and what's happening with procurement and infection rates and vaccination rates. Anyway, here we are now, and we've had these three benefits. We've had the print press, we had the broadcasting, we had the access to information. We still need all of this. We're still on the journey in many countries to get these, but we're en route. And today, this 30-year Windhoek conference is looking at what else we need, because those three elements are no longer sufficient to serve humanity with its information needs for development and democracy. And in summary, you can say that the theme of this conference, information as a public good, is pinpointing not just this history, but also three new elements, which we call VTC. V for viability, T for transparency, and C for capacity. And essentially, these are identified as new areas we have to work on, because without having V, the viability of the media, without having T, the transparency of the internet companies, and without having C, the capacity of people to engage with this complex content environment, without all that, we don't have information as a public good. If we don't have viability, we don't have an independent media producing its unique contribution. If we don't have transparency, we don't know what's happening with the internet companies in terms of how they are managing this huge information system. And if we don't have capacity of the audiences to be able to cherish, distinguish, discern, identify, call for, and protect journalism, if we don't have that capacity on the part of the public, then the game is over. So we need to have audiences with high capacity to deal with all the content that they consume, including understanding the importance of press freedom and the role of the press. That, I think, sets the scene. Africa, this Africa Forum, UNESCO, we look to you to really enrich this new thrust with the conditions and the uniqueness of issues around the continent. And we also call on you, not only in this forum to raise your voice, and we thank those who are going to be speaking, but to go to the website for World Press Freedom Day and look at the declaration, the draft Windhoek Plus 30 declaration, and add your views there, because in the end, we need to have a new declaration that will start a momentum as powerful as that which began in 1991. So thank you very much, and I look forward much to hearing you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nya Booga, who officially welcomed us on behalf of Professor Hubert Hagen. Eisen, who is the Director of UNESCO Regional Office Southern Africa, who could not manage to be with us due to technological challenges. With that remark, allow me to welcome our keynote address from the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information at the CHPR, Honorable Commissioner Jamasina King, who will be joining us online. Thank you.
information held by public bodies and relevant private bodies expeditiously and inexpensively. B. Every person has the right to access information of private bodies that may assist in the exercise. Ladies and gentlemen, as illustrated above, the legal framework for the promotion and protection of the right to access information is certainly not lacking in Africa. However, as is the case with other rights, lack of consistent and effective implementation of this right hinders its realization. In many countries, there are real structural and political barriers which hinder the capacity of governments to produce information and the ability of citizens to claim their right to information and to use it to demand better governance and public services. The reality is that right to information can only be effectively exercised and implemented on the basis of national laws regulating the right in accordance with international standards elaborated above. However, a large number of African countries have not yet adopted national legislation on the protection of this important right. In recognition of this, the Commission adopted the Model Law on Access to Information in Africa, which is a practical tool designed to specifically help African states meet their legislative obligations to give effect to the right to access information. This model law provides a framework to guide governments in developing national legislation on access to information, which meets regional and international standards. In Africa, significant progress has been witnessed in the number of African states with freedom of information legislation. To date, the African countries that have enacted specific access to information legislation are Angola, Benin, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Liberia, Malawi, Morocco, Mozambique, Niger, Nigeria, Rwanda, Seychelles, Sierra Leone, South Africa, South Sudan, Sudan, Tanzania, Togo, Tunisia, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. However, 30 states have not yet adopted specific legislation. Additionally, a number of states currently have pending draft bills on access to information, and these include Botswana, Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, Namibia, Senegal, Somalia, the Gambia, and Zambia. In light of the above, I would like to take this opportunity to call on the participants at this August gathering to continue to advocate for adoption of access to information legislation in accordance with regional and international standards on access to information as embodied in the model law. Ladies and gentlemen, it goes without saying that access to information rights are only meaningful if they are both enforceable and enforced. Whereas access to information legislation is an essential enabling environment for this right, full and effective implementation and enforcement of the national law is a critical component. Principle 34 of the Declaration and elaborated in the model law stipulates that an independent and impartial oversight mechanism shall be established by law to monitor, promote, and protect the right access to information and resolve disputes on access to information. Accordingly, I would like to call on all participants at this gathering to continue to advocate for the establishment of mechanisms responsible for monitoring implementation of national on access to implementation. Ladies and gentlemen, this year's World Press Day theme, Information as a Public Good, serves as a call to affirm the importance of appreciating information as a public good and exploring what can be done in the production, distribution, and reception of content to strengthen journalism and to advance transparency while leaving no one behind. Access to information, in addition to being a basic human right, is an enabling right and vital tool in realizing a variety of political, social, economic rights, and struggle for the right to information and expression the freedom to access official information has been acquiring greater salience. Just as there is no democracy without the protection of human rights, so there is no viable human rights agenda without respect for civil and public liberties, amongst which is the right to information. The right of information is very important for the work of journalists. It goes without saying that an effective access to information regime serves the media. Therefore, the media undoubtedly has a role to play in promoting the passage of comprehensive access to national legislation. Without the active involvement of journalists, editors, and other media practitioners, the fundamental information will not meet its potential for anyone. Our commemoration gives all of us the space to reflect on the situation and the violations they face in their line of duty. In spite of their indispensable in our communities, they are often targets of threats, intimidation, harassment, arrest, and detention, in addition to physical attacks, which have sometimes resulted in murder. The Commission has continually condemned such attacks, most recently in Resolution 468 on the safety of journalists and media practitioners in Africa, adopted during the 67th Ordinary Session held in December 2020, in which it condemned the deterioration facing journalists and other media practitioners in Africa, and urged state parties to ensure their safety and create a conducive environment for them to practice their profession. In concluding, I take the opportunity to call on all students attending this forum to commit to greater efforts towards the promotion and protection of the right of access to information. This can be done through increased advocacy at the national level. With concerted efforts taking into account the current climate of greater awareness of the importance of this right, we can collectively move into an era of unprecedented recognition of the promotion and protection of the right to access information. Thank you much for your attention, and I wish you all the very best in this conference. Thank you.
Once again, a round of applause to the Commissioner. And special thank you to Commissioner King for sparing time and presenting on the key issues that have since impacted on the conditions of service of the media in reflection to Windhoek at 30 declaration on pluralistic and independent media. Thank you very much once again. Allow me to jump straight into a video clip for the next session, which is the Southern Africa Press Freedom Report. We'll start with premiering a video clip. My colleagues from the technical team, thank you.
After years of improvement in the press freedom environment in Africa, media freedom has come under increasing pressure in the last couple of years. This is due to a number of factors, such as the tightening of media laws, the COVID-19 outbreak, and the media capture phenomenon. The unprecedented use of state of emergency and disaster regulations across the Southern African region has seen an uptick in the harassment, arrests, detention, and assaults of journalists. This period has seen an increase in the violation of digital rights, with countries introducing cybersecurity and cybercrime laws that have the potential to impinge on the freedom of the media and freedom of expression. To further illustrate the fragility of digital rights, and by extension, freedom of expression in the region, a SADC Heads of State and Government Summit in Maputo last year resolved to take preemptive measures against the impact of fake news and abuse of social media, particularly in the electoral processes. While the intention may be to curb the spread of fake news, history has shown that a number of countries in the Southern African region have used such laws as a pretext to clamp down on freedom of expression and of the media. In light of these challenges, there is need for a barometer to gauge the state of press freedom in the region. Through the Southern Africa Press Freedom Report, MISA Zimbabwe is highlighting the violations against journalists and media workers in line with the SDG goals 16.10.1 and 16.10.2. The Southern Africa Press Freedom Report reflects on developments in the media sector in 10 Southern African countries. Among other issues, it also reflects on gender in the media and digital rights in the region. The report will be used as a basis for evidence-based advocacy targeting the UN, AU, intergovernmental organizations, regional governments, and CSOs. In Southern Africa, SADC's vision for 2050 is for the community to remain a peaceful and stable region, enabling the further prioritization, pursuit, and achievement of its objectives of socio-economic development, poverty eradication, and regional integration. A free and secure media is needed to support the region in the provision of access to information for socio-economic development, poverty eradication, and regional integration. MISA Zimbabwe reaffirms the crucial role of the media for the SDGs, Agenda 2063, and sustainable development.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I'm joined here by Rashwit Mkundu, the regional, the African sub-region advisor for IMS, who helped me to unpack the key trends that he noticed in the report and proceed to launch it in a scope of 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Rashwit, what's your take?
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity, and greetings to colleagues in this space and to those who are participating online and all protocol observed. I thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak to the key issues that are noted in this report, and also to thank the MISA offices across the region, to thank UNESCO, International Media Support and FOIO for this collaborative effort in continuing a MISA practice of monitoring the media context and using these monitoring reports for advocacy work, but also to capture both the negative and positive trends in the media in Southern Africa. A key issue from this report that I want us to take note of is the continued use of violence against journalists, the continued attacks and harassment of journalists in the course of duty. While the report captures the events or developments in the media sector in the past year, I wanted to draw colleagues and this room to the concern on the disappearance of journalists in the region. Speaking of this, I also want to make reference to similar attacks of journalists across the whole of Africa. I take note that there remains no action and no reports on the disappearance of Mozambican journalist Ibrahimo Baruko, who has been missing since April. There's been no action and no reports on the disappearance of Tanzanian journalist Azori Gwanda, who has been missing since 2017. There's been no reports, no action on the disappearance of Zimbabwean journalist Itai Dzamara, who has been missing since 2015. And us who still have a voice, we who still have our voices, need to speak for those who have been silenced. And we need to keep their memory in our mind for our governments to take action and account for the journalists who have disappeared. And if we keep quiet, then it is an acceptance of this entrenched culture of attacks on media and the use of violence on journalists. The monitoring report captures positive developments that have also been noted by the ambassador, the enactment of access to information laws, freedom of information laws across the region, but there remains a disconnect between the passage of these laws and the practice on the ground. There remains, as I said earlier on, a culture of attacks on journalists, but also a culture of secrecy, regardless of the passage of what may be seen as progressive media laws across the region. We need to move towards more trust between governments and the media and journalists, recognizing the role of journalists, even as that role may make the political leadership uncomfortable. The report notes the growing use of insult laws, especially around digital freedom, online freedoms, or the use of the digital space. And these attacks on not only journalists but activists have the effect of silencing the rest of society. We are seeing a growing enactment of undemocratic cyber laws that again are being used not only on the media but also on the rest of society. And we need, as media advocates, as journalists, as policy regulators, to be reminded of the need to not only promote but defend online freedoms, which play a key role not only in advancing access to information and freedom of expression, but also the developmental needs of our various societies. The report notes again that regardless of growing awareness of gender and media policies in our newsrooms, and indeed the passage of various progressive gender policies guiding our media, there again remains a disconnect between the policy pronouncements and the practice in newsrooms, to the extent that when COVID-19 hit our media, the first to go when media houses were closing or retrenching were female journalists. Female journalists were also the last to be given protective equipment in order for them to do their work in a safe environment. So we still need, as noted in this report, to focus our attention on gender equity in the media. Gender equity in the media also speaks to the challenges and marginalization of women in our society. And COVID-19 has worsened this marginalization to the extent that as many women are now cut off from the information loop. This report lays the ground for continued advocacy work on issues that needs to be addressed in the region. And I note key issues that we still need to pay attention to. One, the safety and security of journalists in the region. There are flashpoints that we are noting recurring, inducing attacks on journalists. One being electoral processes, the second being a protest or the popular forms of expression by various groups in our society, in which the media is seen as fair game when the police seek to control such kind of protest. We also need to pay attention to the contested spaces, especially the continued use of insult laws to attack media and journalists who are expressing themselves online. And again, the need for us to enact democratic cyber laws that not only promote access to information, but also push back on misinformation and disinformation. This report, ladies and gentlemen and Chair, is not a criticism of our governments. It is the reality of the state of media in our region. And we want to use it for constructive engagement. We want to use it for reflection we are hoping that our multilateral organizations present and participating in this forum will also use this report for the peer review mechanisms that are available in Africa, and also that those who are working in support of the media can reflect on the capacity needs within the sector. With these few remarks, Chair, allow me to launch this report, and hoping that in the coming few years, we'll see a huge improvement in the status of the media in Southern Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rashid. As he stands, I will allow him to waive the report as he takes his seat to allow you to be able to locate it as you leave the room. Copies will be outside. Thank you once again, Rashid. As Rashid takes his seat, allow me to call colleagues for the next panel, which is developing the viability of the media and strengthening their role in the production and sharing of development information. Zoe Titus, Executive Director at Namibia Trust, who will be here in person. Omar Farouk Osman, the National Union of Somali Journalists, will be here in person. Jovial Ranto, Chairperson of the African Editors Forum, will be joining us online. Bongeni Mbinko, Deputy Chairperson of the Southern African Editors Forum, will be joining us online. And their capable moderator, Edith Ojo, the Executive Director of Media Rights Agenda and Chairperson of AFEX. Colleagues, allow me to use my powers vested in me to cut a bit on your time. Your session shall be 30 minutes as opposed to 40 minutes as initially planned. Thank you.
Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As the overall moderator indicated, my name is Edeta Nojo. I would be moderating this session. I come from Nigeria, and we tend to be a little bit more noisy when we are celebrating. The room is looking so solemn, and we say we are celebrating. I think we should look a bit more cheerful, despite the difficulties of the present time. So in order not to take too much time, I will not repeat the topic. We can all see it on the agenda. But I think it's clear to all of us that the media environment, not just in Africa, but around the world, but we are principally concerned about Africa at this forum, has become more challenging than ever. We have the COVID-19 situation. We have the repression that I think Rashid just reflected for us, although that was the Southern Africa report. I think all of us from other regions of the continent can immediately relate with that because it's quite representative of the entire continent. And of course, there's the reality that in the digital age, the media giants and the online platforms are sucking up advertising revenue from mainstream media. So all of these are challenges that we are witnessing in the current environment. In the light of this, how can traditional media survive? How can traditional media be prevented from being captured by various interests? I have a number of wise men and a wise lady to walk us through this. I had indicated that each of them would have about 5 minutes to give some opening remarks, following which we'll take some interventions from the floor and from our remote participants, and then give them an opportunity to respond and close. Unfortunately, the moderator, in his dictatorial exercise of his powers, has cut our time. Perhaps understandably, we are running behind schedule. So I would reduce the 5 minutes to 4 minutes each. I know Omar does not do short, but I would have to disciplined he tries. And then we'll see how that goes. Hopefully we'll be able to take a few interventions and then round up properly. So let me just quickly introduce my panelists. I have to my right, Zoe Titus. I think everybody in the room must know Zoe. Sorry, my left. Sometimes when I'm not eating, it's difficult to tell my left from my right. So Zoe is to my left. Of course, Omar is not so beautiful, so I would never mistake him for Zoe. Zoe Titus is the Executive Director of the Namibia Media Trust here in Windhoek, a long-time advocate of media freedom and one of my best friends. To my right is Omar Farouk Usman, who is the Secretary General of the National Union of Somali Journalists, also somebody I've worked with for a very long time and a friend and colleague. We'll be joined online by Jovia Rantau, who is the chairperson of the Africa Editors Forum, and then by Mbogeni Mbigo, who is the deputy chairperson of the Southern Africa Editors Forum. So starting with Zoe, I'll just give each of them an opportunity in the order in which they appear on the program. Zoe, if you could please take 4 minutes to share your perspectives on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. I will do my very best to stick to the 4 minutes. The topic on the table today, you've elaborated on it already, moderator, but at this point in time, COVID-19 is referred to as a media extinction event, coupled with, as mentioned, the decline of advertising revenues, changing media consumption patterns, lack of trust in the media, and the list goes on. The reason for this present crisis has been dissected from so many different angles, so I will not go into the detail of that. I will take rather a very simple, pragmatic approach to this issue. Plainly stated, the writing has been on the wall for some time. The seeds for this crisis started germinating possibly a decade ago. COVID-19 has merely amplified a problem that was already staring us in the face. But how did we get here? The responsibility, I believe, for this crisis lies in many hands. It's a culmination of poor decisions across the board, across states, across markets. We tend to shelve responsibility towards big tech when we should take collective ownership for the crisis as a starting point, from the owners to the managers to the journalists in the newsroom. But we could learn at the same time as we are putting the blame towards big tech, we could actually learn from big tech. They are presently the primary service providers of news because they treat it like a business. And that's what we need to do going forward, but without compromising our ambition to serve the public trust. There's a lesson for this to governments too. Freedom of expression and access to information is good for business. And this thinking should influence our work going forward and our campaigns. But we have to consider the options that we have at our disposal. Right here, the crafters of the Windhoek Declaration, 30 years ago, grappled with this very same issue and pondered at that time what governments could do to encourage free, independent, and pluralistic media. The discussion then was about the responsibility of governments to create an enabling environment stretching across economic and legal spheres. There are robust discussions right now, for example, about possible ways in which governments could fund the media. I'm rather skeptical about that. Whilst it may be a viable option elsewhere, I for one hold the view that in our context, this could be misunderstood and potentially used as a weapon against the media as a means to control and, quite frankly, capture the media. I don't see African governments supporting the media when their preoccupation at this point and well defined and elaborated in the report that was just released, as to rather muzzle critical independent media in a myriad of ways through the enactment of restrictive legislation, to just plain harassment. We are witnessing closing of the democratic space, attempts to control access to and the flow of information. How then, possibly, could we even start a discussion with governments about financial support for independent public interest media? I think that we should consider this enabling environment possibly in a different framework, one that makes business sense to both governments and media. Another option receiving much attention at the moment is the creation of a global fund for public interest media. It's a vehicle designed to collect funds from around the world, from philanthropic organizations and governments, and ideally such a fund would be managed independently with no expectations other than the production of independent public service journalism. It's a noble idea, I know, but it will not be operational soon, and it certainly will not save everyone. But in my view, I believe it provides a reprieve just for a moment for editors to focus not just on putting bread on the table, just for a moment to look at rather assessing audience needs and building audiences, an opportunity to investigate the diversification of revenue streams and to consider new approaches to innovation. In short, moderator, how do we sustain public interest journalism? There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but here are a few takeaways. Effective news organizations must approach the financials with the same vigor and focus and enthusiasm that they have for creating and curating content. In tough economic times, maintain a lean company that still provides journalistic excellence. Branding, communication, and building that community is critical, and it plays a crucial role to determining the success of the media. Revenue models can and must change and look at new approaches, and to seize opportunities, focus on new ways of producing news, information services, curating content, etc. Moderator, chairperson, I cannot even fathom or imagine a future without quality journalism. We must launch campaigns to reassert the importance and value of news in people's lives. We are all fighting, I believe, for the good of our society, for justice and equality. That is the ambition that we fight for the right for equality, when we fight for public interest journalism to survive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoe. I know that the time is really short, but even so, you gave us quite a number of ideas that we can follow up and explore in greater detail later, depending on how much time we have. So I'd quickly like to call on Omar to share his own views on the subject. Omar, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair and colleagues, comrades, friends, and invited guests. I bring you greetings from Federation of African Journalists and Journalist Unionists across the continent. And all protocol is duly observed. As we are gathered in Windhoek, we received the sad news of Ugandan journalist Robert Kagola, who was murdered last night in Uganda. This follows few weeks after 2 journalists were murdered in Kenya and in my country, Somalia. Please let us observe a moment of silence in memory of fellow journalists who have lost their lives on the front lines of the duty since we celebrated World Press Freedom Day last year. Media viability and sustainability in the digital age is a top-of-mind topic, occupying the minds of journalists, media owners, policymakers, and the development community. A major concern is the aftermath of the disruptions caused by the digital on the media landscape as we know it, and how to observe and sustain the values that have defined legacy media for centuries. As journalists, trade unionists, we are concerned about the survival of independent media since it forms an important counterbalance to the exercise of political power and accountability for the actions of those delegated to hold power, as well as the conduct of big businesses. What we have seen so far is cause for worry. The disintegration of traditional media houses has resulted in massive job losses. On the other hand, the journalists who lose employment set up small independent online platforms that are economically vulnerable. To survive, many engage in unethical practices that undermine the credibility of the media or quality journalism that my sister Zoe has just described. On the other hand, the bigger media brands must contend with the global technology companies that offer a lot of free content and have expanded choice for consumers of the media. Big media brands are also struggling because digital has diluted revenue streams. Survival tactics such as native advertising actually give power to business and undermine the practice of independent journalism. Matters have not been helped by the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic impacts that have further forced media to shrink. Equally, while digital is touted as the future, the market has not fully migrated. The big brands that have invested substantial resources in setting up digital platforms are not seeing the money. First, because of the increased competition for advertising revenue, but also because they are not earning money from sales of digital content. Journalists and media workers who play a crucial role in the production and sharing of quality and reliable information, thereby contributing to the free flow of information and ideas, are increasingly working under precarious conditions, especially freelancers. This context increases the risk of media being captured by different powers, political, economic, religious, or ideological. Therefore, developing the viability of the media and strengthening the role in the production and sharing of development information calls for new thinking and a deep understanding of the role and importance of legacy media. A starting point is to recognize information as a public good. That should then be the basis of a policy debate and reform on how traditional media can be helped to survive the transition to the new digital age. The low-hanging fruit is the government is offering tax rebates on the income earned by media houses. This will help lower the cost base for media houses and allowing them to plug the savings back into the production of quality, reliable content. The other approach would be to impose a media tax on technology companies and telecoms, which would then be plugged back into supporting legacy media. The catch in this is that, if not carefully structured with robust constitutional guarantees in place, it potentially undermines the independence of the media, since governments can adopt a carrot and stick approach. Finally, colleagues, perhaps more sustainable option would be for media to work more closely with the development community, to leverage their experience in raising resources for charitable work or arrangements. Hopefully, the current crisis is transient and legacy media will eventually adapt and evolve to survive the new normal that we are all in. But they must be helped to survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. I think that what you're proposing, which to me sounds like a multi-stakeholder approach requiring some policy debates, it's a very interesting idea that I would also like us to put in the parking lot as we return to explore these issues. We move on very quickly to, I don't know who is immediately available, Jovial or Tabani, who is? Okay, so let's take Jovial. Can you hear us? Is he online?
Good morning. Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Presiding Presiding Officer. All protocol observed, and greetings from the African Editors Forum. We meet today in our world in the grips of one of the biggest challenges that have confronted mankind in recent history, the COVID-19 pandemic that is devouring nations. Whilst COVID-19 is in the main a medical challenge, it cannot, however, be dealt with without the key role that the media has to play in advancing knowledge, news, and information to people. This has put journalists and other media practitioners at the forefront of the collective effort to inform our continent about the causes, treatment, and other mitigating factors of dealing with the pandemic. It is for this reason that during this World Press Freedom Day in 2020 that we should stand in solidarity with and pay a special tribute to the journalists and editors who are in the forefront of telling the COVID-19 story. COVID-19 arrived when the media, particularly the print media, had been dealing with serious challenges brought amongst others the digital revolution. The media in general are trying to find answers to dwindling advertising revenues, and for legacy media, disappearing readers, listeners, and viewers. COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on the lives and economies across the continent, leading to job losses, salary cuts, and the closure of some publications. As it continues to infect millions across Africa and the world, the crisis demands more, but not fewer media outlets. It demands bigger and not less newsrooms. It demands an increased flow of information to our people in order to help them to stay alive. In addition to dealing with these serious challenges, the media and the recipients of information have had to deal with what the World Health Organization has described as infodemic, the rise of fake news. Times of crisis of the scale of COVID-19 require bold and visionary leadership to save lives, economies, and jobs. In this regard, we at the African Editors Forum have called on governments and big business, including media houses, to work together to find solutions that will help all of us retain the plurality of voices in the media across Africa. This includes, but is not limited to, publishing digital editions of print publications and ensuring that the poorest of the poor across the continent have access to this through better data connections and pricing. It also includes setting up of special funds to proper publications that are battling to survive. This, however, must be done in such a way that the independence of these publications remains intact. The African Editors Forum has recognized that the COVID-19 pandemic has created unprecedented challenges that have forced governments throughout Africa and the world to implement measures that have effect on the liberties of people. This includes freedom of movement and assembly. We remain concerned that some African states have used the outbreak of COVID-19 as a cover to restrict media freedom. While the restriction of individual rights can be accepted in the context of the serious public health emergency, we have called on governments to be more transparent and for the measures implemented during this time to include a sunset clause so that they do not go on forever and ever. Mr. Chairman, I think I'll stop there and look forward to a very lively and important discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jovial, and also for keeping to the strict time limit. So finally, we'll take the last of the panelists, Mbogeni of the Southern Africa Editors Forum. I hope you can hear us. You have the floor, 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, moderator, and good morning, colleagues from Namibia and all around the world. I find myself feeling very overwhelmed at this point, but also very privileged to sit here and join you on such an important occasion to contribute to the very pertinent discussion of the viability of media, perhaps for the next 40 years. I want to start off maybe by saying that Pulitzer-winning author and former journalist Richard Kluger once said that every time a newspaper dies, even a bad one, the country moves a little closer to authoritarianism. And there I want us to ponder just a little bit and ask ourselves where we are now. And perhaps just this is how, for me, we should approach this discussion with viability, especially in the context of the African continent, certainly the represent African region. Because with what has happened now and with the previous speakers have raised, it is clear that we are faced with a challenge where media, legacy media itself is struggling to survive. And especially in the wake of the perilous status of the media, core media ecology, and the impact of COVID-19. A few weeks ago, the Southern African Editors Forum hosted a series of us as a allude to this important theme of one of us was on this very topic. Industry experts from the region with long experience in journalism practice gave a very timely, valuable, and insightful perspective on this very topic. And I think, moderator, I want to raise just a few pointers from that discussion. There was a very general acknowledgement in the discussion of the perilous state of the media in the continent. It was clear from the discussions that already debilitating existential challenges for media. The biggest challenge for media viability is, of course, overeating. Newspapers have newsrooms have shrunk, and mean structure changes to remain afloat. And with that, the whole ideal of a free internet landscape has remained or has looked like a very, but we challenge ourselves to finding the solution that suits the times, and so we're now in. As 30 years ago, a free and independent press. Media viability for us requires that the overall economic and business environment provide conditions that are conducive for independent media operations, and by providing economic stability, fostering the ability of the public to consume media, and providing resources necessary for viability. I think, therefore, the proliferation of the online media consumption, especially of the print versions of legacy media, should be a wake-up call, or it is a wake-up call, to how media viability needs to be tackled as we begin a new dawn 30 years on from the Windhoek Declaration. It is a challenge to all of us to find creative ways to ensuring that the world does not become authoritarian as more and more papers fold. During our webinar in April, panelists in the region suggested that one way of tackling this is for a multi-sector dialogue and concrete ways to balance the economic dividends issue. The Southern African region has called for attention to legislation aimed at impeding media freedom and freedom of expression, as well as the role of the media to deepening democracy. For us in the region, 5 key points were the outcome of our webinar. 1, on the economic part, identify creative and innovative models. 2, political dimensions. We need to find proper policies that do not impede media freedom. We need to tackle the tech giants and the digital world by looking for, well, considering challenges that are going to sort the long-term issue of how we deal with tech giants. And then also we need a strong and trustworthy media that stands on the foundations of verifiable, transparent, public interest, independent and pluralistic media. And lastly, societal co-creation of media that incorporates principles of participation and engagement and media literacy. In conclusion, moderator, I personally believe there's a bigger discussion we need to have. And one of these is training of media to find our new entrepreneurial journalists who have worked in the newsrooms, who will understand the dynamics of where we are and who will be able to innovate as is a demand. We need to have a new discussion as well on how the models of funding the media need to be worked out, because it is clear now that we cannot compete with the tech giants in the way that we currently are set up. And I agree with my colleagues who've spoken before me that there is a new way, or there's a challenge for us that needs us to understand how to move forward from here on, especially regarding funding models for legacy media. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that although we had a very limited time and put all our presenters under pressure, we have nonetheless gotten quite a number of ideas. In order to ensure that these ideas are not lost, I would plead with all the panelists, especially those who had speaking notes or written presentations, to please share them with us so that we can properly harvest all of the beautiful ideas. I have conflicting instructions from 2 different masters. One says we can go on to 10:50. The other one tells me to wrap up. I'm not sure which of my masters I should obey at this point in time. Okay, the wrap-up is insistent. I was hoping that at least we could take a couple of comments or feedback from the floor, but since we don't have any time, okay, we can go on. Okay, thank you. So can we take 1 or 2 participants from the floor who really have something important to contribute and commit to doing no more than 1 minute each? Does anybody want to contribute from the floor? No? They've covered everything? Brilliant. Okay, so given that we are not depriving anybody of the right to freedom of expression, I think that I'll just come back to the 2 panelists here, if they can take a minute each for any closing comments. I like the idea of that freedom of expression and access to information are good for business. If we had more time, I would really have loved to see how we could develop that further and maybe use it as advocacy with governments, because they generally like things that are good for business. Maybe that would convince them to open up the space for media, and Omar's idea of a policy framework that enables media to also access resources. And I think that Zoe also made the point about our recognition of media being a public good. Once we all accept that as a basis for going forward, then it might not be so difficult to find ways to ensure that media is supported to continue to provide information as a public good. So, Omar, let me give you the first shot this time. 1 minute, please. Closing comments.
Yeah, well, the most important point here is that we find a way that we can have the media with the new normal is properly invested in terms of policy-wise, and it is not just an ad hoc. So when the media is effectively and properly resourced, then coming from the point of journalist unionists, that is where you can improve the quality of journalism and the media's content and preserve its independence. That's why we believe that there must be a departure from the old phenomenon, whereby the media was just investing itself, the private media, and saying, disregarding the technological challenges and the digital challenges that they have, posed. So for us, what we need now with this new normal is to develop a new policy framework which deals with investing with our media so that we improve the working conditions, and just the media owners or the media companies are not said, oh, we are financially restrained and we do not have the necessary resources to remunerate our journalists or our reporters, and to reduce the number of increasing freelance journalists.
Thank you, Omar. Zoe?
Edit, I stand by my statement that freedom of expression and access to information is good for business. In 2018, our governments signed the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and it's becoming operational now with its secretariat in place. And that is potentially a game changer for media policy on the continent. And we have to speak this language. If we cannot prove that, I don't have to prove it, it is very clear. Our governments are saying that you need a solid, stable democracy, and a solid, stable democracy requires press freedom and a freedom of expression, and an environment where citizens have access to information, which is their right. So, for that stability to be there, and to promote trade, that stability is required to promote trade. And this is good for business. It's good for development, and it fundamentally moves us towards our Vision 2063.
Thank you very much. Our time is up, and we really have to bring this session to a close. I would like to invite all the participants to join me in acknowledging and thanking our panelists for sharing their thoughts and ideas with us. Could we please give them a round of applause? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chairperson of the session, Edit and team, for the great work done. And at this moment, allow me to thank them as they take their seats and prepare for the next session, which is reinforcing the transparency of online platforms and as an essential pillar for information to remain a public good. This is a discussion which will be held by one person online and the rest being in person. I want to check with my colleagues if the online colleague is with us. Okay. So can I invite the following people to the platform, to the podium? That is Gilbert Sendugwa, the Executive Director of Freedom of Information Center, Dr. Delta Nto, Media and Communication Advisor, and Professor Admire Mare from Namibia University of Science and Technology. Professor Mare will moderate. Our apologies. One of our participants who was supposed to be online, Mr. Boerema Odrago, please pardon me if I mutilated this name. I hope he will manage to join as the conversation progresses. If not, we'll proceed with the colleagues who are with us, and we'll kindly request him to share his presentation for further circulation once it's possible. So this is to you, Professor Mare, and colleagues. Please welcome the panel.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moyo. Welcome to my panelists. I've got two panelists on the platform right now. I've got Gilbert, I also have got Delta. All protocols observed, otherwise I may miss out on acknowledging certain people. Without wasting much of our time, I'm going to give my panelists 5 minutes each to just tell us about their own understanding about this particular topic that we are looking at the moment. I'll start with Gilbert, and then I'll move on to Delta, and then I'll also bring in somebody online. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, moderator. Dear distinguished participants in the room and online. This topic of transparency of online platforms is very, very important and timely in the context of rising authoritarianism in Africa and around the world, the growing power of business and economic interests, but also in the context of the need for people to have information that they can trust and use to influence or participate in decision-making that affects them. Now, what we see with online platforms and particularly technology companies is that over the past few years, and more so since the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, their influence has grown so huge and powerful. Other companies, as you've heard in the previous session, have been struggling, but these ones are creating billionaires. They also significantly influence decision-making and policy, not necessarily for public interest, and therefore regulation is very, very important. The other issue is that they hold large volumes of personal information, which many times is not, or the public is not assured that this information is safe and is used in the best interest of the owners of this data. In the context of elections, we also note that these platforms have become, an area of huge interests. And because of that, there have also been temptations, balancing business interest with public good has been challenged. And then, of course, the issue of huge sums of money being raised. So what is wrong with the current regulation? The first issue is that nobody knows the inner workings of internal regulation, how it works, and for whom this regulation works. Secondly, the issue of balancing reputation of these platforms vis-a-vis accountability to the public when there are breaches? Will they be prepared, to be transparent on the breaches that have happened? Leak of data, for example, use of data for commercial interests and others. And then also the issue of the current mechanisms not being as transparent and open and not being accountable to the public and owners of the data. But also, when we think of going forward, there's a challenge around the universal scope. Are they using the national frameworks of where these platforms are registered and exist? What happens in other jurisdictions, and particularly where national governments have less power and control and influence over these platforms? I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Gilbert, for such a thought-provoking submission. I move on to Jauta. You can take over.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll just pick up from where he left off because I think it's better for us to not be repetitive. So picking up on the issue of to what extent do governments influence tech companies, for example, governments in Africa? What leverage would they have? And that's an important point. And it's something that the Rankings Digital Rights firm looked at when they were reviewing recommendations from nearly 100 digital rights experts from around the world. And the consensus was to say there should be a mechanism to apply an international human rights framework, because then that would overcome such barriers. Because when you place it within an international human rights framework, it then is applicable anywhere in the world. So that kind of framework could set a standard that goes beyond simply saying tech companies should do no harm or saying tech companies should be ethical. There have to be very specific standards to which those companies are accountable to which they can be held to, mechanisms for risk assessment. I think he has spoken to some of those risks, mechanisms for redress when harm has been done, and also individual empowerment for technology users. So within that scope. So I think that would be one entry point. And then some of the issues he has raised, I think also invite us to critique the issue of the use of algorithms. We have limited power as users. My assumption is tech companies have to be accountable first and foremost to the users. But we understand that users don't have that kind of leverage. You can't make Facebook, behave in a particular fashion. Even if we try to encourage users to boycott these tech companies, that is not likely to happen. So in what ways do they protect themselves, their data, their privacy? One of the key issues is around public trust in these companies. Can we make the assumption that they work in the public's interest? The scandals that have arisen from companies such as Facebook and the like tell us that they don't act in the best interest of users. They also tell us that they have specific business models that are in conflict with the public interest. Business models that are driven by the need to advertise and that are also driven by specific algorithms that allow them to target, and use behavioral techniques in order to do that targeting. So while we are aware of all these things, we know that the users are not in any position, as it were, to bargain around how these companies treat them. So it reminds us of the need for consumer protection in other sectors. We don't seem to have a robust consumer or user protection within the context of tech companies. And that is also why we should push for that international human rights framework, because that would be a very significant framework within which to advocate, to do research, within which to lobby for the unpacking of the black box, so to speak, of these companies, to understand how those algorithms actually operate, and to also be able to have transparency and accountability. So you would also consider the place of Africa as well in the global conversation around, disinformation and the abuses and uses of tech. We know that Africa's voice is not as loud as perhaps bodies such as the EU, as governments such as the US, where these companies might be more beholden because they have to answer to regulators within those companies. It therefore calls upon us perhaps to also consider an approach such as the EU's approach. The EU came up with a code of practice on disinformation, to just say the tech companies that operate within the continent, they have to abide by this code of practices. It is insufficient, it is inadequate, but it gives them a starting point, a framework. So from the perspective of maybe a body such as the African Union, what can we Africans say speaking in one voice? And this, of course, would require the African Union to be able to incorporate the voices and perspectives of multi-stakeholders that are already working around issues to do with freedom of expression online, to do with transparency, to do with privacy. So I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Delta. I now want to move on to Beknabe. I've been told that Beknabe is now online. I've been told that Beknabe is online. Can he speak to us? I'm giving him 5 minutes. It seems as if our
Allô, vous m'entendez?
Go ahead, Beknabe.
Allô?
Yes, go ahead and give us your remarks.
Parlez français?
Okay, I've been told that he's going to use French. Can we use our technical gadgets to make sense of what he's going to be saying? Thank you so much.
Allô?
Beknabe.
Ok. Je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez. Moi, je n'ai pas de retour ici. Ok. Sinon, je suis Bourema Ouedraogo. Je suis journaliste, directeur de publication bimensuelle Le Reporter. C'est un journal spécialisé dans l'investigation. Et je suis également président de la Société des éditeurs de la presse privée au Burkina Faso. Donc, c'est un honneur pour moi de me joindre à vous. C'est dommage que moi, je n'ai pas le retour pour échanger autour de ce thème qui est effectivement d'une actualité brûlante, surtout dans nos contrées. Alors, je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez, je peux continuer. Et j'ai combien de minutes?
You can continue.
Oui, je crois que... Ah voilà, maintenant je crois qu'on va pouvoir s'entendre.
Okay, talk to him quickly.
Borema? Monsieur Borema, allez-y, vous avez 5 minutes.
Vous m'entendez maintenant?
On vous entend très bien, allez-y. On vous entend très bien, allez-y.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Donc, avant tout propos, je voudrais effectivement saluer le choix de système effectivement qui est d'une actualité brûlante, surtout pour nos pays. Vu d'Afrique de l'Ouest francophone, effectivement, cette question de l'accès à l'information en ligne est une préoccupation, d'autant plus que, effectivement, nos gouvernements ont essayé la plupart du temps, effectivement, de créer des open data pour rendre accessible toute l'information. C'est d'abord un devoir de redevabilité, c'est d'abord aussi une exigence de bonne gouvernance, c'est surtout aussi comme on appelle, un engagement à rendre disponible en tout temps et en tout lieu l'information relativement à la gestion du bien public au Burkina, dans nos pays, particulièrement au Burkina Faso. Donc aujourd'hui, pour faire effectivement de l'information un bien commun, il faut d'abord qu'il soit disponible, accessible en tout temps et en tout lieu. Et aujourd'hui, les plateformes numériques nous en offrent l'opportunité. Malheureusement, on a comme l'impression effectivement que, comme si d'autres questions de développement, nos gouvernements sont beaucoup en retard parce que les plateformes sont construites, il y a des données, mais c'est des données qui sont loin de refléter effectivement ce qui se fait au quotidien. Donc, difficile effectivement de permettre aux citoyens d'avoir accès à l'information, encore moins aux journalistes. Quand vous pratiquez, vous avez effectivement de pratiquer les data, de faire du data journalisme, vous vous rendrez compte que les données disponibles ne sont pas, les données ne sont pas toujours accessibles. Et quand elles sont disponibles, elles sont parfois en retard. Et ça pose énormément de soucis par rapport au travail journalistique parce que on a comme l'impression qu'on fonctionne avec quelques années en arrière par rapport à ce qui se passe au quotidien. Or, pour que les plateformes soient fournies et transparentes, il faut bien effectivement qu'il y ait une constante actualisation, ce qui n'est pas le cas, en tout cas pour les cas spécifiques du Burkina Faso que je connais. On a plus de données aussi, peut-être aussi grâce au travail aujourd'hui d'un certain nombre d'acteurs qui essaient, eux, de reproduire sur des sites un certain nombre d'éléments d'information relatifs à la gestion publique, sans forcément que ce soit par le fait des gouvernants. Mais l'un dans l'autre, effectivement, ça contribue à rendre accessible un certain nombre d'informations sur Internet. Et on a vu aussi que la question de fond aussi, ça permet aussi que on crée une certaine possibilité de vérification du discours politique. Je vais vous donner un exemple. Lors des récentes élections, des dernières élections au Burkina, il y a un réseau de journalistes qui ont créé un réseau de fact-checking pour vérifier effectivement si le discours politique était conforme à ce qui se passe dans la réalité. On a vu, par exemple, des choses qui ont été annoncées comme réalisées par les acteurs politiques. Et quand ils ont fact-checké, ils se sont rendus compte effectivement que ces informations ont été largement gonflées et ne correspondaient pas à la réalité. Donc, du coup, on fournit un certain nombre d'informations tronquées à l'opinion pour se faire une certaine, pour se faire une certaine popularité et donner l'impression qu'on agit pour le compte des populations. Et malheureusement, on n'en donne pas totalement, effectivement, les vraies informations. L'autre aspect aussi sur lequel on est confronté, c'est la question même de l'accès au marché public, par exemple. Quand vous prenez le domaine des marchés publics, excusez-moi, c'est le domaine effectivement où on devrait avoir suffisamment d'éléments fournis qui permettent de vérifier effectivement si à la fois les prétendants, ça dit les entrepreneurs qui soumissionnent au marché, est-ce que les informations qu'ils fournissent pour obtenir le marché sont conformes à leur capacité réelle? Est-ce qu'ils peuvent faire le travail? Ou bien, quand le gouvernement, par exemple, passe un marché, est-ce qu'on a la possibilité de vérifier s'il n'y a pas eu de surfacturation en connaissant déjà les prix réels pratiqués sur le terrain avec d'autres entreprises, avec d'autres offres? Donc, véritablement, on est dans un défi, effectivement, où il faut renforcer, effectivement, d'abord la disponibilité de l'information sur les plateformes en ligne, ensuite aussi les rendre beaucoup plus transparentes pour faire en sorte qu'on puisse permettre aux citoyens, aux journalistes de vérifier régulièrement et de pouvoir puiser aussi, s'il le faut, pour que l'opinion puisse avoir accès à l'information qui, effectivement, comme on le dit, doit être un bien public et non pas, effectivement, par le fait, par une préoccupation des seuls journalistes. Parce que la question de fond sur cette question, sur cette problématique-là, est liée au fait que nous avons affaire à des gouvernants qui ne sont pas enclins à la redevabilité, qui ne sont pas enclins à rendre compte effectivement de leur gestion. Et dans ce cadre-là, les journalistes qui fouillent pour voir effectivement si ce qui est annoncé et effectivement ce qui est fait est perçu comme un empêcheur de tourner en rond. Et du coup, on essaie de lui cacher l'information. Et quand on cache l'information aux journalistes, on la cache du moins à l'opinion publique. Ce qui veut dire effectivement que on n'est pas encore arrivé même au stade où effectivement, même au niveau des gouvernants, on acceptait le principe que l'information est un bien public qui devrait être accessible à tous en tout temps et en tout lieu.
Before coming through, can you sum up your argument? We want to move on to other issues. Thank you.
J'ai combien de temps encore pour... Allô?
Hello, Begnabe. We want to bring back the discussion back here. Can you sum up your argument? Just finish. Can you just finish your argument?
Est-ce que vous pouvez terminer, s'il vous plaît? On va continuer avec la discussion. Merci.
You have exhausted your time,
Quelques derniers mots,
unfortunately. All right, thanks a lot, thanks a lot, Begnabe. We want to bring the discussion back here.
Merci beaucoup.
We want to bring back the discussion here. We want to go back to Mr. Gilbert. I want you to tell us, there's an understanding right now that platform companies must probably set up things like oversight bodies, or they must, periodically give us what we call transparency reports. How effective are these in terms of ensuring transparency and accountability in Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. I think the key issue is the debate should be on the presence of an effective, transparent, and auditable regulation mechanism. Whether that is one that is set up by the technology companies themselves, I think is a question that needs to be discussed. I think the issue of independence and trust is critical for a regulator to have. And this may not be best attained when, it is set up by the agency to be regulated itself. Second, regulation should take into account and ensure protection of rights to freedom of expression, access to information, and privacy of users. So this is one of the critical areas that should be addressed. Transparency also should be based on standards and principles of democratic societies. Many times, especially where you have conflicting and competing interests, this may die. Regulation may not be effective. So I think those 3 points need to be taken care of to have a sound regulatory system.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. I move on to Delta. What do you think about this issue of transparency reports, oversight bodies that are being created by platform companies to pretty much, like the public or the users?
Okay, self-regulation is one of those topics that always become controversial, because it's like asking a fox to guard a hen house. And it also relies so much on trust, on assuming that these companies will act in the best interest of the public. These big tech companies have been part of something that we could liken to a self-regulatory membership organization, the Global Network Initiative. And despite being part of this kind of initiative, we still see all the scandals that we've seen. So that tells us that in the absence of mechanisms that can monitor, mechanisms that can enforce compliance, it's difficult to see how far self-regulation can go in terms of actually improving accountability issues. And given the level of impact that these platforms have, it's not surprising to find that sometimes governments want to conscript them into law enforcement roles or duties to say, okay, we see some activity that we have outlawed in our country. We need you to give us this data because we want to enforce laws within our country. So issues around what exactly is done in terms of the data that people put into these platforms is so important. Issues around how they moderate content, how they decide what is hate speech, who makes that definition. We know that there are always robust debates in any spectrum. And so who gets to be the mediator of those debates or discussions? And also we appreciate that these platforms are also used in contexts where algorithms that only detect English won't know, in African languages, there could be terrible things that are said, but the algorithm won't capture it. So there are all these gray areas in terms of who decides, what are the limits of free speech and where does hate speech begin? A lot of the advocacy that we do is around our freedom of expression. And we don't do enough, I think, as freedom of expression advocates, to also speak around the need to self-police. Do we call each other out? Or we only wait to call out governments when they are cracking down on us? So all those things matter. I think it should be a component of it. And what's always missing in these discussions for me is the issue of women's rights online. Like there's so much silence around how the internet and these platforms are used to consistently violate the rights of women, to harass them, the amount of bullying, especially with women in politics. But there's always this silence, as if we have to deal with bigger issues first, then we'll get. So I think there has to be a holistic, conversation and very specific standards. I think one of the issues around content moderation, for example, before we even get to asking the tech companies what choices or what criteria did you use to take down certain content, maybe the conversation should start from what is acceptable content in the first place. How do we all come to the consensus? Because the issue with, for example, with human rights, they're very broad and generic. We can all agree that children's rights to education is important. That's a fundamental thing. But in practice, when you have maybe religious groups that don't agree that children should go to school, now that is also in conflict with other rights. And so there is need for that kind of nuance as well. But of course, like I said earlier, Africa doesn't have the kind of voice. We know that in countries like maybe in America, in Europe, these tech companies have actually been brought before parliaments, before congresses to answer, to policymakers, to answer to legislators. I don't know if Africa would have the kind of power to actually summon them, to say, come, we have questions for you. So we don't have that. So all we might be able to do is to start thinking around how do we influence at a UN level perspectives from Africa in terms of what we feel would help to push forward the discussion around transparency, around accountability for these tech companies.
All right, thanks. Any questions from the floor? Are there any questions related to this panel? Are there any specific questions? Okay, I see there's a question there. There's another one at the back. Can you give them a roving mic, please? Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is George Nya Booga. I think Delta and the other panelists have talked about maybe the need to lobby important institutions and bodies like the United Nations, and perhaps we start with the African Union. But also mentioned the fact that we are unable, maybe as a media, maybe fraternity, and of course maybe the stakeholders, to come together as a united force. And we know that the media has the capacity to do that. But maybe we need solutions rather than lamentations to a large extent. So as the experts, what one strategy would you recommend to do this, to enable that we lobby these organizations, to ensure that our voices are heard, and to ensure that these tech bodies, for example, do not engage in exploitative behavior that, of course, puts Africa in danger, if you may. So what one strategy would you recommend as a solution to the challenges that we face?
Okay, thank you. I think we can take another question and then we can answer. There's another here at the back there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Franz Kolike, so Namibian freelance journalist. Perhaps my question really, seeing that we are really in the era of digitalization, and in most cases, tech companies, what is happening in Silicon Valley is serious. The ownership of those platforms we are not really present or on the table. They are really doing everything according to their own or according to the law of their own country. So I have in mind what is happening with Google. Google, for instance, through their subsidiary AdSense or YouTube, if you are creating content and you put it on their platform, especially those viewers who are maybe in their countries, now they are moving to deduct you 24% of your earning. And I think as African media, we have to craft a position on the way forward. Because how things are now, we are losing out. Because we are not being progressive on finding online instrument. For example, tax treaty with those countries. We are not there. So, but this online platform, they are engineering their own tax, but our countries and our institutions are not present. I think we need to find a way to protect and also engage those institutions, those platforms. So I just want for us really to think in the line of designing or developing online treaty for our own audience in the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will give the platform to my two panelists on the table to look at the first question, which related to how do we lobby going forward. And I think the second issue that Franz raised, I think relates to the issues around, this media tech. So I think we have seen in Australia the mandatory bargaining code, where they are saying, these platform companies must share some of their monies with the local media organizations, so as a way of sustaining their operations. I'll start with Gilbert.
Yes, thank you very much for the feedback and comments. George, the recommendation to lobby. I think here we have to reflect on whether, the interests of users are necessarily aligned to the interests of these companies all the time. Now, if the interests are not aligned, then the lobbying might end up, in what you have called lamentation. So while examining and looking at that issue, and therefore on where there is alignment of interest, yes, lobby and advocate, but where it is not aligned, where we see abuse of data, where we see unethical use of this platform for business interests, I think we have to work for, in the space of working for getting these companies to be compelled. And I like the suggestion and recommendation to work through the AU and national governments to have appropriate frameworks that would, promote, transparency and accountability in this space. But also, that said, taking an example of one of the countries, Ugandan elections, which was very, violent and hostile, and in one of the contested spaces was actually the online platforms in which the government requested for the accounts of activists and supporters of the opposition to be pulled down. And Facebook was not convinced of the arguments and requested that government should provide copies of the court order on the basis of which it will take the action to pull down these accounts. So again, the point I mentioned earlier on, that regulation should be in the context of the values and principles of democratic societies is quite fundamental. And the AU has come up with key frameworks and instruments on governance, like the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which I think could help provide some framework in this issue. Now, on the second comment on this revenue sharing and taxation, it is an important issue, but I think it works where there is transparency. How do you know that these companies have fully declared the income that they have earned from, for example, that country? So in countries where the source of information is the companies themselves, this might be a challenge, but is a good recommendation that should be considered, and then see how to actually make it effective and work.
Delta?
Okay. Yes, thank you for chiding us about lamentations. We were just guided by the questions we were given. So to respond to the issue of what practical things could we do, could we anticipate doing, for example? I think definitely a multi-stakeholder kind of coalition in which we are clearly articulating what our expectations are. Something similar to the African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms, for example. We need something similar, but speaking to issues of transparency, accountability from these online platforms. And we know that there is impact in terms of crafting such declarations because we're here today because of a Windhoek declaration that led to the adoption of a day as a World Press Freedom Day. So we know this works. So that could be a starting point. Harnessing these ideas, harnessing these recommendations, harnessing these multi-stakeholder views and perspectives. So that's a starting point. And then how exactly would we get our voice across? That's also an issue. But we know that Africa is one of the continents, or at least spaces, that are still considered to be emerging markets by tech companies, which means there is some leverage in us being an emerging market. This is where they want to come and expand. And we know that making money is important to them. We know they've set up bases here. There's Twitter in Ghana, there's Facebook in Joburg, and I think Amazon is in Cape Town or something. So they have come to us, which means there is, some area in which we can get to voice what exactly we hope to attain in that discourse. And in terms of the revenue, I think that was well explained, but I also wanted to add the dimension of saying that we must also realize the context in which these tech companies are used in some of our local contexts, a context of internet shutdowns, where governments exercise brute force, where it doesn't matter how powerful Facebook is as a platform. If a government shuts down the internet, this entire discussion is moot. So we were also alive to those issues. And as it pertains to revenue, one of the things we've seen is social media taxation on the continent, which means that it limits the amount of consumers or users that can afford to even access those platforms, which also affects perhaps the baseline of these companies that see us as an emerging market. So all of these contexts, all of these nuances really invite us to actually have a substantial document, declaration, position informed by all these realities. Thank you.
Thank you so much to my two panelists on the table and also my other panelist who was online. I want to thank you so much for your attention. I think what has come out very clearly from this platform is that I think we need to do more as Africa to make sure that there's transparency and accountability in the way how these platform companies actually work. And I think auditing algorithms could be one way of doing it, but also I think issues to do with making sure that transparency reports are done comprehensively so that we know that when the government actually requests certain information from these platform companies, we know what is it that they are requesting. Because oftentimes this happens without us knowing exactly what they are seeking from these particular companies. And also the issue of, I think, user data harvesting. I think it's an important issue that as Africa, we should not let it lie down. We need to take these companies to task over these issues because we know what Cambridge Analytica told us about what is really happening behind the scenes. And I think going forward, I think Africa must speak with one voice, and I think starting at an African Union and then taking it to the UN level, I think that is where we can actually probably have a better conversation. Thank you so much for your attention. Without wasting much of our time, I think we will end it here. Thank you so much.
We have a question from the online audience. We have a question from the online audience. Susan Juliet is asking through the platform, how can we effectively ensure the African Union mechanisms on compliance for the member states that continue to violate fundamental human rights?
Okay, anyone of you can take it. Delta?
Okay, sorry, what was the question?
Can you say that question once again? Sorry.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that we take the questions from the online audience connected through the platform. So Susan Juliet is asking, how can we effectively ensure the African Union mechanisms on compliance for the member states that continue to violate fundamental human rights? Thank you.
Thank you. Delta?
Thank you. I just want something on behalf of the artist, because I don't feel artists are well represented here. The expression of the artist very much exploited. I'm Banana Shakupe, I'm the artist, president of the Artists Union. Talking about Uganda also, there was problem with the artist running away in the bush because of their expression. The artists are most exploited on this platform and also on the expression, because artists are not allowed, even in Africa, to perform, even to worship the way they want to worship, even with what type of instrument they have to use in the church. They are told, not this instrument, use the Western instrument. These are things which is happening with the artists. They use their bodies to express themselves. They use their voices. They use relics. They use stories. But some of these stories are also not allowed on some of these platforms, because these platforms are owned. We have to get platforms which are not owned, because the owner said, you must do it this way. I want you to exercise yourself on my platform this way. Maybe we don't own these platforms. We must talk about that.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll hand over to my panelists to look at these issues. Thank you.
Okay, all right, so to respond to the issue of, the fact that there are member states in the EU that, don't comply with the policies, the regulations, the frameworks, that's true. But I think the important issue here is we need to have the standard. What is the standard? So that's what we're aiming for. Let's have the standard. And then we use that standard to be able to then lobby and advocate. Our activism should be able to say, well, we're measuring these practices against this yardstick, and they're falling short in this manner. The issue with regulations is that, they sort of have a three process to them. You set the regulations, or you create those regulations. That's the first step. The second step is you monitor. Are people adapting to them? Are they adopting them? And then the third step is then you think about enforcing, because monitoring tells you whether or not people are complying. And if they're not complying, then you start thinking, how can you enforce compliance? Now, when we're talking about member states that, that contravene AU precepts, we're talking about the non-compliance of these states. And that brings us to the issue of governance. When we have authoritarian states, the measures to enforce compliance in such states, they are they are impossible. It goes beyond, I think, what a continental body can do, because there will always be questions of sovereignty, for example, or at least appeals to sovereignty. So what we are discussing, or perhaps what we can pursue, is a standard. And then to say where companies see that, maybe let me put it in a different way. We are starting off saying Africa is an emerging market for tech giants, which means they are also invested in the operating environment within the continent to the degree that their investment would be safe. And we know that there are some states where investments aren't safe, where investors aren't comfortable. And such investors would also be incentivized to support democratic, governance calls, governance actors, governance advocacy, if for no other reason than the fact that they see an avenue to make profits. But if the operating environment on our continent is one that is hostile to those sorts of investments, it then means there are other avenues to influence those states. Those avenues may not be the AU, those avenues may be investors at the end of the day. And we know that transparency is possible. We've got examples. So for example, in late 2020, okay, this is my final example. In late 2020, we know that, the MTN group, for example, released a transparency report. And in this report, they outlined group-wide, because they operate all over the continent. They outlined group-wide the due diligence framework that they were using. It included data about the volume and the nature of government demands for user information and some forms of network restrictions in 17 markets. So you see, this information is now coming out from the corporate sector. It's not even the activism side, the civil society side. So there are so many different interests in terms of trying to ensure that democracy is entrenched on the continent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just one sentence, Gilbert.
Thank you very much. So on the issue of what to do with violations, first of all, to recognize that every treaty that has been that has come on board has a mechanism for enforcement and oversight. And in the context of human rights, we have the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and the African Court on Human and People's Rights. Now, the problem with this is that there's a provision and requirement that, for one to go to the African Court, for example, you must exhaust local remedies. And then two, the state must have made a special declaration allowing citizens and civil society to use that code. These have been two significant challenges. And then in the context of the African Commission on Women and People's Rights, when you check, many countries are late by more than 10 years to report. And when they report, the Commission gives recommendations and observations, which then provides a basis for improvement. So, way forward is to raise awareness of citizens in each of these countries, because even when they don't comply, citizens who are aware make complaints, and the various treaty bodies, invite states parties to respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your attention. We stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mare, and your panel for quite a rich discussion. Please, another round of applause as they take their seats. Allow me then to move to the next session on strengthening media and information literacy capabilities in the times of disinformation and hate speech. Please, panel members that are here, make your way up front. Ronald Moni, President of the Ghana Journalists Association, Professor George Nya Booga, School of Journalism and Mass Communication, University of Nairobi, Miss Juliet Amwa, Executive Director at Pen Plus Bytes, and their moderator, Frederico Links, Institute of Public Policy Research, Namibia. Moderator, the session is yours. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tabani. The previous panel, I feel, sort of segues us straight into, the issues that around media and information literacy, and of course digital literacy, that we'll try and address in this session. I just want to briefly again introduce our panelists. We have Mr. Ronald Afei Moni, I hope it's correct, who is the president of the Ghana Journalists Association. He is a member of the National Media Commission of Ghana, Eminent Persons Committee of the Electoral Commission of Ghana, and a board member of Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition. He is a steering committee member of the Federation of African Journalists. Then we have next to Mr. Moni, Professor George Nya Booga of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Nairobi. He worked as a journalist before joining academia. His last positions in the media were managing editor in charge of weekend editions and managing editor Media Convergence at the Standard Group in Kenya. He is also the secretary of the Eastern Africa Editors Society and an executive council member representing academia in the Kenya Editors Guild. Welcome, Professor Nya Booga. And then we have Ms. Juliet Amwa, executive director of Pen Plus Bytes. She is a trained journalist and also the national convener of the CSO platform, working in tandem with government to achieve SDG Goal 9. I've sort of, summed up your bios. You can get a full picture of our panelists online, and they are quite impressive. So to jump straight into our discussion here, around media and information literacy in the context of disinformation and hate speech on the continent. Perhaps we'll start off with just Mr. Moni giving us an overview, a brief overview of what's happening in terms of trends, actors, and impacts in the space of disinformation and hate speech in West Africa. And then immediately following that, Professor Nya Booga will address these issues from the East African perspective, just giving us an overview of what's busy happening. Over to you, Mr. Mani.
I bring you greetings from the Federation of African Journalists, FAJ, particularly from the President Sadiq, and also from the Ghana Journalists Association, where I do voluntary service as the president. And let me recall with grave concern the political developments in Ghana, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Nigeria, and Niger, in respect of their recent elections. The common trend is that during election period, newspapers with zero credibility, dubious websites with poisonous content spring up. We also witness massive invasion of the media space by politicians who set their disinformation machinery into motion to insult the opponent, defame the opponent, malign the opponent, and pour all kinds of unprintable insults on them. Some elements in the traditional media also double the twin evil of disinformation and hate speech. For example, in Ghana, some panelists on traditional media went to the extent of labeling all female politicians as prostitutes. Some called the ruling party supporters, politicians, as thieves. And one classic example of hate speech was that all supporters of the opposition party, main opposition party, NDC, are fools. All this escalates the high voltage tensions and red hot anger which characterize Ghana's election. You know, any dodgy election is likely to produce an iffy outcome. Little wonder that the Ghanaian election ended up at the Supreme Court. So it was decided in favor of the ruling party. It also took, you know, Ghana is a religious country, so it took the redemptive benevolence of God, and of course, intervention by public-spirited Ghanaians, pastors, Ibn Chambers, to help calm a volatile situation. Ghana was teetering at the brink of self-destruction. So it took quite an effort to pull the nation back from the precipice which it found itself. So all this is a result of disinformation at its highest level and hate speech. So we need to deal frontally and deal surgically with the issue of disinformation and hate speech. Otherwise, it can spell doom for the future of not only West African countries, but the world at large.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mani. Professor Nya Booga.
Thank you very much, and it's always good to be part of these conversations. And let me start perhaps by referring to what our previous panel stated. And this is the fact that, you know, when we look at hate speech, it's a gray area. And there's some sort of definitional ambiguities to some extent. And this is oftentimes applied from time to time to settle political scores in some situations. I mean, I suppose we can offer various examples to try and illustrate where this has been applied. In Kenya, for example, we have what we call Cybercrime and Computer Misuse Act of 2018, which states very clearly that, of course, people cannot use their computers or their gadgets to publish, false information. And from time to time, bloggers and social media activists have, for example, been arrested and prosecuted for using computers to bring, for instance, the office of the president to disrepute. And that is a very serious challenge to issues of freedom of expression, particularly using some of these platforms to advance certain ideas, particularly those related to transparency, accountability, and of course, responsibility in terms of how government and officials do the governing of the country. And let me state very clearly from the East African region, for instance, very specifically to the question that I was asked to respond to. The East African region, as you know, is suffering, of course, very serious challenges, mostly as a consequence of disinformation. The fragile, polarized, and fluid political situation is, of course, partly to blame for the levels of disinformation. And the examples, for example, that we've seen in the media in the recent past, the Tigray region in Ethiopia, and the implication of the media in conflict. And of course, we started to see a clampdown, despite the fact that Prime Minister Abiy, for example, won the Nobel Peace Prize. But the moment he got to power and there was conflict in parts of the country, and we know how polarized that country is, he clamped down on the opposition. He started to clamp down on the media. And consequently, there was some sort of hate speech on social media platforms, and especially social media platform has become culpable for some of those accusations relating to hate speech. And I did some research there, for instance, a few years back, as the country was preparing for the election that was postponed. And one of the findings is that social media activists had become very prolific in terms of producing content that was sometimes not palatable to the country, but content that was bordering on hate speech. We know examples from Uganda, for example, and the amount of disinformation, especially on opposition candidates. Bobby Wine, of course, was violated, his rights were violated, his supporters' rights were violated, and up to now, we know that so many people have been disappeared, so many people have been killed, for expressing difference in terms of opinion, and that's why I said there are these ambiguities in relation to hate speech. And President Museveni is on record stating that, they were trying to bring the country down. And again, that is maybe selective application of hate speech laws and hate speech, or intentions to obviously arrest hate speech. The same thing applies to Tanzania, and especially, prior to the death of President John Pombe Magufuli, who himself was, of course, not a very good friend of the media and took criticism very seriously, and, his intolerance to either press criticism or, criticism from political and other opponents. The situation is not any better in Somalia, South Sudan, Rwanda, and other countries where freedom of expression is, of course, restricted. And from Kenyan, perspective, we're not doing any better, despite, of course, the constitutional protections that we have. The Constitution is very clear that we enjoy freedom of expression, we enjoy freedom of the media. But from time to time, as I said, some of the laws that were developed to operationalize the Constitution have not been very friendly to freedom of expression because of, what we've seen, what hate speech can do. For instance, the post-election violence in Kenya of 2007-2008 was largely a consequence of hate speech. Especially on vernacular radio stations and mobile telephony, and to some extent social media. So it would seem that one of the biggest culprits is, social media platforms, where it's,
it's not easy to control what people share on, various, emerging social media platforms, and especially WhatsApp. So whilst it's easy, for instance, to lobby Facebook and Google to bring down some of those sites, it's very difficult to do the same on WhatsApp. And this is especially because, people form groups, share information on those groups without asking what that information can do, and asking whether that information is itself true. The other culprit is, to some extent, and this may be partly conspiracy theory, but there's evidence to show that the state itself is actually culpable for some of these things because of advancing certain agendas, and because they have the machinery and the resources to start disinformation campaigns, particularly when it relates to the opponents. So, they may label these opponents as agents of destabilization and agents that want to destroy their own countries. But of course, and maybe this is actually said without any apology, the worst culprits are us, the people, who use this platform sometimes without questioning the capacity of those platforms to engender, for example, violence and conflict. Sometimes we share information, and I am guilty. We share information without asking the source of that information, without asking the accuracy of that information, without asking whether that information is true or not. And I suppose this is the reason why I think this session and these conversations are important. We must ensure that we possess the literacy to understand the information, to understand the sources of that information, as a way of ensuring that whatever information that we put out there is accurate, is truthful, and is not dangerous to society.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of leads us into the next question. But I feel we're sort of getting into the territory of lamentations again. Yeah, I mean, it's clear to all of us that the information and communication landscapes and environments on the continent are very messy and polluted at this stage. And I think, I mean, there are actors out there who are deliberately, from states and from private individual, at a private individual level, who are engaged in, destabilizing information and communication environments and ultimately societies. So, I mean, I'd like to ask Ms. I'd like to ask Ms. Amor to come in here and just, Mr. Moni sketched a scene for us of what happened in Ghana. And I know your organization, Pen Plus Bytes, does work in this space in terms of digital and information literacy. Perhaps you could speak to us about, the initiatives that are on the ground, that are active in this space within the Ghanaian, and sort of also touch on some other West African information and information literacy initiatives at the same time.
I'm not sure if anyone can hear me.
We can hear you.
I think I've lost audio.
We can hear you.
And so, Frederic, I can't hear your question.
Ms. Amour, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Thank you.
All right. The question was, I hope you heard Mr. Moni's comments to start us off.
Yes.
Yeah. So against the backdrop of what Mr. Moni said, sketching the West African situation in terms of disinformation and hate speech, perhaps you could just comment for us on some of the initiatives within the media information literacy space in Ghana and across West Africa that are currently trying or dealing with these issues on the ground.
Well, thank you very much. Before I get into it, I'd like to comment on some of what the professor said. And what we're noticing in my area of work is that, like most emerging social media can actually enhance the way that you do your policing, because then it's used as a listening and monitoring device. And and what we then did was we offered training to capacitate the service in the proper use of these alternative tools. The results were that we averted the internet shutdown, and this then led us to that point where we realized that, look, we needed to become, as Pen Plus Bytes, more involved in the process of media information literacy if we were going to help the state and its citizens live with less tension in the rapidly evolving digital sphere. And so in 2017, we started MIL workshops. We trained a group of multipliers, about 50 people who would each then do cascade training of about a minimum of 10 people. So we then had a critical mass of circa 500 MIL practitioners at the end of that year. We have then moved across West Africa. We're doing work in Nigeria, Mali. We've done work in Cote d'Ivoire and Benin, where we've moved into training social media influencers and group administrators on WhatsApp, because these people have hundreds of followers. And so we know that by getting them more aware of MIL, as laid out by UNESCO, we can help to start getting a keener, more aware media consumer. And so this year, we're also introducing a film series to reach a wider audience who perhaps, because of a lack of internet penetration, may not be able to engage with social media in some of the same ways that urban populations do. And so they, in their instance, they still rely on legacy media to stay informed. And that's why we're training them via film about the MIL principles, which are, that any consumer of news or of, content online should be able to analyze the content and evaluate it, and then be able to create good content that then helps with the media environment.
Thank you, Ms. Amoa. Professor Nya Booga, perhaps you can speak from a East African perspective on what's happening on the ground in terms of media information literacy.
Let me mention a few things that we've done, partly as the East Africa Editors Society. We've recently, for example, organized meetings with journalists, civil society, government, and other actors to ensure, of course, that they understand the role of the media, and especially the importance of freedom of expression, and especially emphasize the point that freedom is not always absolute, that freedom must be exercised responsibly. And this is especially because, and we reinforce this point from time to time, especially because we know the dangers of hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, and of course irresponsible and unaccountable use of various platforms, including, of course, the irresponsibility and sometimes unaccountable journalism and the media that is from time to time used to, of course, advance certain agendas that may not always align to those of society, agendas that may not promote the good of society. We know, of course, what happened in Kenya in 2007-2008 during the post-election violence, where the media has been blamed for the loss of more than 1,300 lives, and of course the injuries that many people still face today. Years earlier, we know what happened in Rwanda, where disinformation led to genocide. And I wanted to just refer to some of the studies that came out of the inquiries. After the post-election violence, for example, in Kenya, there were inquiries, and one of them actually accused the media of playing a role, and especially the radio, vernacular radio stations or local language radio stations, which showed that there was evidence that those stations were culpable for spreading hate speech. And one report that was done by the Kenya National Human Rights Commission, which is a government body, revealed two things and came up with two conclusions. One of them is that vernacular radio stations played a negative and inflammatory role in that violence. The second one is that the circulation of malicious cell phone texts and messages propagated hate speech and alarming rumors. And this had the effect of poisoning an already tense political environment. And we know that this has happened in various places. So based on those reports, based on that realization that the media is a powerful tool, for instance, we've held meetings, and two very recent ones with editors and civil society organizations from Uganda, Tanzania, South Sudan, and Ethiopia to discuss to discuss strategies of how to promote media and information literacy, so that people can start to understand and appreciate the role of journalism, the role of information in the cultivation of peaceful society, where of course people live in peace despite their differences. And one of the ways that we thought is that the media could be at the forefront of actually promoting media and information literacy, so that people can understand how is it that this information is sourced, and what do those sources mean when they say maybe something and they wanted it covered in the media. And how do you promote, for example, the transparency in terms of, how the media operates and the kind of information that emanates, particularly from the powerful and elite in society? So when the president, for example, comes on TV, do people understand the kind of information the president shares, and do the citizens that are going to use that information understand that the president might be speaking maybe from a party line, and consequently that information is meant to promote a certain idea or a certain ideology that is meant maybe to promote his own position. So I think these conversations are important as a first step towards promoting media and information literacy. The other issues that I'll respond to, especially on your questions, but maybe I give yes.
Yeah, I think, having heard what Professor Nya Booga just said, I think, if we look at what Afrobarometer in 2019 found, that there is general declining trust in the media across the continent, and that this declining trust in the media has the consequence of also a declining within the general public, African general public, a decline in the appreciation for the importance of media freedom. On that, looking at that, Mr. Mani, what is the approach, or what is the Ghana, your organization, sorry for that, doing in this space to try and draw back or address the issues that are undermining trust in the media in your country around the issues that you sketched earlier?
Let me first of all comment on what Prof said about the need of the media playing a frontline role in educating people about media literacy. And let me quote what Ann Landers once said. He said, "The naked truth is better than a well-dressed lie." And the naked truth is that journalists are not whiter than white, neither are they purer than pure when it comes to committing the sins of disinformation. When it comes to media literacy, some are stark illiterate in using the media. In Ghana, many are in the profession by accident, in the sense that because they see it as a glamorous profession. And in Ghana, the entry point is so loose that anybody at all can just masquerade as journalist. And our laws do not also help matters. Our laws do not frown on who qualifies or who does not qualify to practice journalism. So as we speak, Ghana has been convulsed by a heart-rending, soul-wrenching, spine-chilling, and heart-breaking story of two teenagers who killed a 10-year-old boy for ritual purposes. And what nourished the anger of the Ghanaian citizens was that the boy confessed that he picked the habit from the media, where money dabblers, pastors of dubious credentials, where all kinds of quacks are allowed to practice ritualistic machinations and all that. So this poor boy was addicted by the get quick rich mentality. So the two boys lured a 10-year-old boy into an uncompleted building and killed him with the view to making fast, quick money. And the media has come under attack. And thankfully, the authorities moved with promptitude, urgent promptitude, to close down offending radio and TV stations. Many stations are operating without license. And what is happening is that because of the explosion in digital capacity, we have hundreds of radio and TV stations. And because I said our laws also state that there shall be no impediment in the way of anybody who wants to establish a medium of mass communication. So, as a result, it's a free-for-all system, free-wheeling system. So this has prompted the convening of stakeholder engagement, and then the outcome was that there should be a legislative response to the recklessness and carelessness on the Ghanaian media space. So a committee has been set up, but the government was instrumental in calling this engagement. Ghanaian Association was represented. I was there physically. National Media Association was there. And other stakeholders came together, and we were going to form a task force to monitor the media space and draw the attention of the authorities to deal drastically with people who abuse freedom. Freedom is the essence of our profession. We do understand. In Ghana, we've come a long way from yesteryears when we were shackled by all kinds of restrictive laws, when we were hobbled by all kinds of constraints, when we were enveloped in the so-called culture of silence, in which free speech was criminalized. So we now find ourselves in an era of freedom. But the conclusion of the listening public, of media consumers, is that Ghana has won the war for quantity, but we are yet to win the war for quality. So this necessitates the enactment of a law to regulate and deal with people who abuse freedom.
But that's in terms of, I'm trying to understand correctly, it's in terms of entry into the media profession. Is that what you're referring to at the end there?
No, we're looking at content regulation. The entry point is so loose. That's one factor, which allows all kinds of people who masquerade as journalists to do what is unthinkable in the name of journalism. So this is one causal factor of the Ghanaian situation, where anybody at all can just get up and then practice journalism, because our laws do not frown on that system. But to address what the two young killers did, there's a need for stations, first of all, which are not licensed. With the newspaper, you don't need any license to operate a newspaper, but you need authorization to own and operate a radio or TV station. But we have a lot of people who do not have authorization, but yet they've littered the media space with all kinds of content. And what you consume If you consume poison, then your poison attribute will manifest in the murder and other unthinkable offenses we are witnessing in Ghana.
Yes. So, I mean, having said that, I'd like us to just end off by, considering what we've said here, and then the question is in the title of this panel discussion, which is how do we strengthen media and information literacy capacities? And I'd like, Mr. Moni, I'd like you to address this from the perspective of the news media. What needs to be done to strengthen news media's capacities in the media information literacy space? Ms. Amour, I'd like you to approach this question from the civil society perspective. What can be done to strengthen capacities in media and information literacy? And Professor Nya Booga, could you speak to what can be done from the academic perspective, what we need to do in this space in media information literacy? So I'll start with Mr. Moni.
Joseph Pulitzer, the famous American publisher and editor, once said, journalists are educated and not born. When he made this controversial statement, he was pelted with all kinds of verbal stones for saying the unsayable at that time. In those days, journalists trained by osmosis or on the job. But the complexities, the dynamics, the challenges of the profession are such that journalists ought to be capacitated in order to do their job to the satisfaction of the listening public. Many of them are more discerning than we are. Many of them are more educated than we are. Many of them are more decent than we are. The fact that we have unhindered access to the microphone or to the to newsprint does not give us the license to inflict all kinds of things on the listening, reading, or viewing public. So education. We need to train and retrain journalists, many of them, to understand the magnitude of what you do, the implications of putting anything out there for the consumption of the public, because when you consume poison, then you are likely to also exhibit the effect of poison. So training is very important. And then we also need to, media literacy training will also enable the public to be conscious about what they consume from the media space. An example is what I narrated about two teenage killers.
Thank you. Ms. Amour?
That we're constantly living in a fractured public sphere, and that there are lots and lots of differences in the way that we experience things. And so for us, when we're looking at this issue of how do we curb hate speech, how do we get to a place where everyone understands that, yes, we have a right to create information, share it, and a right to self-express. But as the professor said earlier on, that right also has its limitations, and we can't go on in the name of diversity and perpetuate provocative speech. Then it brings us to the point where we are looking at a multi-stakeholder approach to resolving the issue. And for us, it's important to look at the media, as Mr. Afaimoni was just saying, and looking at how they can help police the space. And what I mean by this is that they now need to be able to speak about the evolution of technology. They need to look at and perhaps observe the way that citizens are consuming information so that they can pass this on to duty bearers and lawmakers, policymakers, so that these policymakers can now start to develop progressive laws and policies which take into account the intricacies of technological developments. Um, all of us must start to self-regulate, and I think civil society leads the way in that, because we know that we walk a tight rope between um, serving the people that we represent and also making sure that the governments are empowered to um, do good governance that allows our societies to thrive. And so when I say we need to start to self-regulate, I'm talking about steps that organizations and entities can take to preempt or supplement governmental rules and guidelines. And these self-regulation efforts should include investments in media information literacy and increasing the transparency with respect to tech or technological algorithms and ad policies. We at civil society can also, through capacity development or technical assistance, um, start to work with the media, because Mr. Afemoni does say that media systems are weak across West Africa, entry points, all the rest. Teaching media persons also is a problem. And so we can start to develop and implement new business models with media organizations, and then give them tools and techniques to grow their revenue and expand their audiences. Because when they do this, they will then start to move slowly away from the need to sensationalize, which they think is a way to earn attention and thus revenue. And finally, we can advocate for MIL to be added to school curriculums, whether in a school, face-to-face time, or as part of the after-school programs that are run across. And we could also then start to look at UNESCO's recommendation to work quickly and more single-mindedly with local governments to create what they're calling the media information literacy cities. These are essentially communities in which the local governments raise citizens' awareness about MIL by organizing at least one public activity in a public space to promote MIL understanding continuously.
Samoa, thank you very much. I was trying to interject the few points. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up here. But I understand there are some questions. Apologies, Professor. We won't be able to get to you.
Okay, the first question is, what are the perspectives of using media information literacy as a strategy to empower citizens dealing with dis or misinformation, fake news? Is there any, or hate speech? Is there any best practices for the continent to share? And then the other question is that, seeing that media literacy has become a crucial part of our lives, do we need to include media and information literacy training into our primary and high school curriculums?
I think we'll take those two. I think Mr. Moore has addressed the issue of us. There now is the need to influence a curriculum, whether it's at school level or tertiary levels. But perhaps you could speak to the first question, Professor.
And perhaps this gives me an opportunity to make my concluding remarks that I didn't have an opportunity. I mean, we're in the business as academics of, imparting knowledge, sometimes creating and imparting knowledge. And this is based on the notion that knowledge is power, although often, of course, it is what you do with that knowledge that is important and that determines that power. And this being the case, I wanted to say that we as academics, and I think all over Africa, we've had several studies and conferences at which media and information literacy have been discussed. And this is mainly based on the fact that, for us to deeply understand the role of media and information literacy, to understand the roles of the media, people must understand what that really means in their own context. Remember, context, I think, is important in how we understand this. So including media and information literacy in curricula at university level and in teaching material, I think is important. I think we've started to do that. all the way even from primary school, so that people, as I said, the challenges that have arisen as a result of the way people use media information, the way they appropriate the social media technologies and the other technologies, and obviously share the information. Sometimes it's that lack of understanding of what it can do, that sharing of information can do to society. So, you know, the fact that we develop training material, we put it in our own curriculum is important in ensuring that even the young, and as they grow, they understand what that entails. And I just want to quote quickly, you know, what DW Academy, for example, says. And you know, this is perhaps very important, that media and information literacy is about equipping citizens with the competencies and skills to engage effectively and responsibly with media and information systems. And this enables people to become active and critical citizens who can participate actively in civic life and democracy. And let me just finish by quoting what our great statesman and icon Nelson Mandela once said, that education is the most powerful weapon with which you can use to change the world. And I think media and information literacy education is important in changing the world and our understanding of the media and what it can do.
Thank you very much, Professor. There's one question from the floor, I think. Oh, there are a few questions. How many?
Hello. So my name is Peter Kukwe. I'm actually the president of West African Journalists Association. And I wanted to just provide some backing to the points raised by my colleague from Ghana. There is an issue I personally can excuse or appreciate without, you know, supporting people who are not journalists using social media and using hate speech. But when hate speech comes into the traditional media, and media journalists especially being involved, then there's an issue. And I wanted to raise the point of political journalism. There are journalists who are doubling, acting as politicians and journalists at the same time. And that accounts for some of the hate speech that we get in, especially political seasons. They are using their platforms. They are being used by politicians to get at political opponents. And that accounts for some of the hate speech that we get. I mean, whatever we...
I'm going to have to stop you there. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for your comment. I think this is a discussion that we can take further, and a discussion definitely that should be addressed at various platforms across the continent's information and communication spaces. So I'll wrap up there. I think important points have been made that we can take further, and recommendations can flow out of these. And let's see what comes out of the rapporteur's report later on. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you very much to everybody who tuned into this discussion. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Frederico, and your able-bodied panel. Another round of applause on cue. As they take their seats, allow me to make a small announcements to all our panelists, speakers, your excellencies, and moderators. Please kindly facilitate for the sharing of your presentations so that we can assist towards the crafting of the final resolutions. Thank you very much. The next session is the presentation of the report the untapped potential of regional cooperation for media reform in Southern Africa. This is an online presentation by Professor Herman Wasman from the University of Cape Town. Professor Herman, hope you're on standby. You have got 10 minutes to go through the report and summary findings. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in Windhoek, but I'm very glad to be able to follow the proceedings. So I only have 10 minutes to go through the report, and I'll try and just give some top-level highlights of it. It is downloadable. The report is downloadable on the Center for International Media Assistance website. where you can read it in full. So the title of the report, The Untapped Potential of Regional Cooperation for Media Reform in Southern Africa, as you can see from the title, the point of departure here is that cooperation in Southern Africa among media institutions, but also other stakeholders in the media is important. And it is important when we think about the role of the media in the region. So the point of departure of the report is that independent media are a critical component of democracy and sustainable development in Africa. Achieving African development goals such as good governance, economic prosperity, and poverty reduction depends on defending and deepening the role of the news media as sources of reliable information and also as platforms for citizen voices to be heard. These goals can best be achieved when independent media organizations, but also free speech activists and proponents of media freedom work together towards common aims. So if we look at previous efforts and if we commemorate the landmark Windhoek Declaration year today, we can see that previous efforts to build these sort of coalitions highlighted clear benefits of coalition building. It can encourage collective action against threats to media freedom. A coalition can amplify local voices in regional and international forums like SADC or the African Union, or where internet policy is being made. A coalition can activate diverse human, financial, political, and legal capacities in the region. It can provide a platform for cross-border learning and also connect smaller countries to the resources of larger ones. So really a coalition establishes leverage and benefits for national media reform as well. So in this research that I conducted, and many of the colleagues here present today have also participated in this research, I asked participants also, how can a coalition of media organizations, civil society actors, advocacy platforms, and funders in the region better enable a coherent, impactful, and sustainable regional response to some of the challenges facing independent media in Southern Africa? So how can a coalition work to meet those aims? And then also, what are the priority areas? If we are saying that a regional cooperation between these various stakeholders is important, what are the priority areas to focus on first? And then thirdly, what can be learned from prior regional efforts, prior attempts to work together, these stakeholders building a coalition? What can we learn from prior efforts for successful cooperation to mobilize and support organizations in the region? So here are some of the findings. With all the organizations and individuals that I spoke to, there's a broad consensus that multi-stakeholder networks of non-state actors working with governments, politicians, regional and international organizations, also regulators and law and policymakers can play an important role in helping to build a supportive environment for independent media to thrive. So there's broad consensus that this can be a good thing and that can support independent media. There are, however, still questions as to precisely what format this network should take, how the network should be sustained, and who should take the lead in the implementation. So when we talk about leadership and leadership among these organizations, some of the questions is, should there be one organization that leads the way? Are we talking maybe about rotating leadership? Also, how do we move from research to policy and action? How can we decide on what limited set of focus goals can work best for such a coalition? It is clear, however, that in coalition building in the region, we need broad sectoral engagement. So we need political actors, we need civil society organizations, faith-based communities, we need citizen organizations, researchers, academics, policy think tanks, journalists, human rights organizations. We need all of them to buy into the importance of independent and free media in the region. And we need all of their support to build a coalition that can achieve these goals. We know that there are challenges ahead. If we want to build a coalition of organizations and stakeholders in the region, there are financial and logistical challenges. We have to talk about how to fund this coalition and also what are the best funding mechanisms. There are operational questions. So what size should this coalition be? Should it be a lean and mean, agile organization, or are we talking about establishing another bureaucracy? There's consensus, I think, that we don't want a big hierarchical bureaucracy of a coalition, but rather one that can respond quickly and effectively to specific challenges and goals. And these goals can be protecting journalists. We know that the safety of journalists in the region is really an important issue. Impunity of governments that threaten and harass journalists. Internet governance is an emerging area, a huge area. The sustainability of media, we've heard about the sustainability issues already today. These goals and these challenges are really important for a coalition to work towards. But there are quite a number of challenges that we first need to meet. So, emerging from the report, three main recommendations. The first is that we need to identify the assets and emerging priorities. So what do organizations have? What assets do they have that they can put towards such a common goal, such a coalition? What are the main priorities? We need to identify them first. And then we need to develop an efficient organizational structure. What is the best structure to support such an effort, such a coalition? And thirdly, we then need to engage a wide network of stakeholders and citizens. And these are the three main recommendations coming out of the report. So in conclusion, to say that there's strong enthusiasm and motivation among participants in the region. All the stakeholders that I spoke to are really enthusiastic about the potential that a coalition of stakeholders in the media in the region can provide to meet these important challenges for independent media. The ideals of Windhoek are still with us. We are still working towards meeting those ideals, and a coalition of stakeholders can do important work to meet those challenges. There's strong belief in the potential impact of collaboration. Collaboration among organizations in the region is really important if we are talking about strengthening media independence, ensuring sustainability, and also ensuring political accountability, because that's one of the main roles of the media, is to ensure political accountability in the region. And it's better if organizations work together to strive to meet those goals. So there are many opportunities for collaboration and innovation. We need to think about what are the priority areas, what should such a stakeholder network look like in practice. But I think there is tremendous goodwill, tremendous energy and enthusiasm in the region that we can build upon. So I would invite you all to download the report from the CIMA website and read it and engage with it, and also looking forward to any comments and suggestions that you might have in this regard. Thank you very much.
To Professor Hemen, and the report is accessible online on the CIMA website. This takes me to the next session of summarizing the key issues. This will be done by Nya Machazi. Nya, you have got 5 minutes to round the discussions. Thank you.
Excellencies and the guests present here, all protocols observed. I'm just trying to go very quickly through this because a lot was spoken, and 5 minutes is very punitive, but I'll try and get through it. Okay, as introduced, my name is Nya Machazi. I'm the regional rapporteur. I work for MISA Zimbabwe. So you may all agree with me that we heard from notable guest speakers on the subjects of the threat of internet regulation, increasing attacks on journalists, and the threat posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, disinformation to democratic disinformation, and what threat it poses to democratic institutions, and as well as threats to free press and electoral processes. Going further, some of the discussions that we had is that there's now a deliberate effort by some African governments to undermine freedom of expression and of the media through promulgation of COVID-19 regulations that seek to regulate free speech at a time when Africans need accurate information to make informed decisions about their right to life, their right to health, and their need to access to information. also, we discussed that journalists are expected to provide a service whereby they assist the public in making informed decisions by disseminating trustworthy information, and also that there is diminishing trust in the media. One of the main issues, I think, in terms of that could lead to diminishing trust in the mainstream media is that there is airbrushing of women. And looking at this conference and the people here, I think at the next summit there's need to improve in terms of gender representation, because we're leaving out a very big constituency in the name of some of these meetings and sessions that we have. There's also lack of diversity, and there's need to introduce media literacy in school curricula. So generally what we agreed on is that a free press holds people in power to account, and the absence of curtailment of a free press is a huge threat to democracy, as it prevents the exposure of malfeasance by people in power. So I'm getting to the end. I hope I haven't exhausted my 5 minutes. So what we see is that there's a need for government, the UN, and intergovernmental organizations to support public interest media through the Global Fund for Public Interest Media. And there's need to develop and strengthen the role of media and journalism in controlling corruption and fostering transparency. In addition, there's need to invest in information environments that promote accountability. In addition, as we go further, there's need to support effective regulation of digital platforms, in particular with regard to algorithmic transparency and the fight against dis and misinformation. There's need for an international human rights framework that governs digital platforms, and there's also need for standards to safeguard women's rights online. There's need to provide high-quality journalist coverage, in particular in rural areas, by promoting community media reporting in minority languages, and this will help in terms of media literacy. There's also need for African governments to take all measures that are necessary to guarantee the safety and security of journalists. There's need for the governments to ensure that the cybersecurity regulation is informed by the revised principles of the ACHPR Delegation on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, which recognize internet as a digital right. Governments also need to ensure that the media is free and secure, to ensure that media can play a role in promoting integration. And also, there's need for a roadmap upon which countries that enacted repressive legislation during the outbreak of the pandemic will review and repeal these laws. I think, in a nutshell, I tried to capture everything that was discussed. Thank you very much.
Another round of applause for Ngaba. He managed to live in his 5-minute allocation. This takes me, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues here present and those online, to thank you for taking time to commemorate this historic moment. It was in 1996 that the President of South Africa, then Deputy President Thabo Mbeki, in motivating for a new constitution, he said, on a day like this, we must start from the beginning. And indeed, as we close, we must start from the beginning. Today we stand tall and proud of the moments and the great strides that were taken by the visionaries who sat here 30 years ago. And that the deliberations of today have shown commitment towards leapfrogging and ensuring that the declaration remains a live and responsive document that responds to the ever-changing needs of the peoples of Africa. With that, I want to thank you wholeheartedly. Thank all the participants. Thank the government of Namibia, UNESCO, and all the presenters. Allow me to call this meeting to an end, and all the logistical issues will be addressed while we are offline. Thank you very much. Apologies. I'm told that all the speakers, moderators, and those that participated, can we have a group photo? Thank you.